Hello, welcome to the 7th Annual Getting Played Symposium on Equity in the Entertainment Industry and Awards, hashtag Getting Played Symposium. I am founder Kathleen Tarr of Caramel Skin Tones and multicolored, mostly light brown hair, wearing a rather large black headset and orange turtleneck. Many thanks to co-host Myrton Running Wolf, keynote Tatiana Lee, our panelists Michelle Kantor, Nikko Kimzin, Margaret Lake, and Rebecca Murga, tech producer Natalie Andreen, ASL interpreters Annie Dieckman and Juan Ramirez, and to all of you for joining us in conversation today. Thank you also to this year's Getting Played Equity Award recipient, Clifford Alexander Jr., whose efforts 50 years ago to usher equity into this industry deserve infinite accolades. And gratitude to the Ohlone, the original stewards of the land I am currently occupying here in the San Francisco Bay Area. In the interest of time, we will not be reading the full bios of our speakers, so please visit the website. All participants' opinions are their own and do not represent their employers, affiliations, or Stanford University. Thank you, Stanford's program in Writing and Rhetoric, for sponsoring these annual symposia since their inception. And although this symposium is being recorded, it may be made available only in part after the event, so don't go anywhere. You don't want to miss anything. Speakers we will be hearing from today are without question going to contribute deeply, humorously, and profoundly to this year's theme, the role of anti-intellectualism in the persistence of inequities in the entertainment industry. What jumps immediately to mind when I think of the topic includes the seemingly benign, like George Clooney floating away into space for no reason founded in physics. And the more concerning, which may explain that moment in gravity, the instruction I've received over and over again in most of my screenwriting courses by Hollywood insiders, that to propel a narrative forward, make the characters do stupid things. I'm not kidding. Anti-intellectualism also shows up in how well-educated talent are received. And I know Mert's got his own stories, so stick around for that. But when I was just starting out as an actor, I once asked at an audition how open the director was to my character as the only Black character in the script and the only one with a college education. How about she not be the only one to speak in vernacular English? At the time, I actually had my education on my resume, not anymore. A producer apparently complained after my not quite what we were looking for audition. Who does that Harvard expletive think she is? Another producer, more recently, who had invited me to Cannes, dropped that idea when he decided my role as a public intellectual was not aligned with the values his production company wanted to project. As we pull back even further, we can see that we have nurtured a culture wherein people don't particularly celebrate or show up for ideas. They show up for celebrity. When I delivered the general session at the California Bar's annual meeting in 2015, organizers made sure I had celebrities at my side. I've been told that I need to be paired with a celebrity who will pedestal my intellectual contributions if I am ever to be heard. Ticket sales, registrations, platforms, income, and power go up not because of ideas, not because of betterment of society, but because of fandom. Art falters in this system. The entertainment industry offers addiction, emotions at the ready, very rarely art. There are thousands of terrific scripts that never get greenlit, stories that never get told because instead we need another blockbuster remake of the same formula story told in a new location and with the latest hotness. Playwright Larissa Fasthorse was told by a prominent producer who loved her script that depicted life on a contemporary reservation that he was rejecting it because, quote, "My son is 5, and like me, he loves everything about Native Americans. However, he still believes that your people live in teepees and ride horses. I could never be a part of a project that ruins that for him." It reminds me of a recent meme making the rounds. Theaters in 2020. We take this time to reflect and remember why we make art, and we can't wait to tell important stories when the curtain can rise again. Theaters in 2021, we are so excited to announce Grease as our first show to reopen our theater. It reminds me also that reporters cover the actors and singers and professional athletes who speak at events as if the brilliant panelists who add intellectual value to ideas weren't even in attendance. It reminds me that instead of trying to understand and comply with employment discrimination laws, even advocates for inclusion in the entertainment industry have decided that these laws should not apply, if they even bothered to read a statute in the first place. It reminds me that Matthew McConaughey polls well in the Texas governor's race. And Tony Goldwyn, who played President of the United States on Scandal, spoke at the 2016 Democratic National Convention for some reason. And of course, that the previous squatter in the Oval Office, who wouldn't have received any votes without celebrity, gifted Brett Kavanaugh with a Supreme Court seat, who this week authored the opinion that permits sentencing juveniles to life without possibility of parole, despite clear precedent holding such to be punishment both cruel and unusual. Anti-intellectualism has severe consequences, but the entertainment industry tends to favor that which thrills us. Fantasy tentpole films create a future in outer space, hoping you'll forget that you and I and all but a handful of our planet's almost 8 billion people are never going to go anywhere else. While we colonize Mars with our bacteria and spill tardigrades on the moon and leave our poop there, we are destroying a habitable planet that we need in order to live. For what? Certainly other Earthlings haven't deserved to be extinguished because one species can't bring itself to stop buying and producing things we don't need. Yeah, I see George Clooney floating off into space, and I think we're going to kill this planet. All of this blame at the foot of entertainment? No. And there are films and plays and operas and more that both entertain and enlighten us. But we know it is the emperor's new clothes that draw most of us to the square. And our blindness, our willful ignorance, sustains the narrative. The invisible cloth is capitalism, which demands waste and pointlessness in order to sustain itself. So great projects that might wake us up from the screen, stage, the arena are passed over for the ones that say nothing, but are assured to make money. We can complain about Ancient Aliens and what happened to the History Channel or Nova, or why am I seeing K-pop when I turn on NASA TV? But we are the ones who made it this way. I was shocked when MFT Leslie Kirby stated matter-of-factly during her interview for my Getting Played documentary that some people just don't like thinking. What? Frankly, it had never occurred to me that anyone would prefer a timeout from thinking, but it's sadly true. And entertainment media seems to be looping this dynamic. Intellect is what inspires us to envision the future we want to live, the one that is possible and ethical and just. It is what helps us reverse engineer how we collectively get there with a viable strategic plan. Instead, the entertainment industry seems to actively eschew intellect in favor of delivering our next fix, the next episode, the next season, the next release date, the next time we can see Grease in the theater. But on a Saturday afternoon, you have chosen to attend the symposium, to think, to question, and we appreciate you joining us in conversation about not only today in the entertainment industry, but also how to shape a different, better, more equitable tomorrow. So thank you. In a few moments, Myrt will introduce a clip from his film Black Warrior of Pyramid Lake, a project that most certainly does not try to feed audiences an escape. Trigger warning that the film incorporates strong language and violence, so if you need to step away for those 4 minutes, please do. Myrt will give you the cue. After that, we will hear from our keynote, Tatiana Lee, followed by a panel discussion and audience Q&A. We will end the symposium with presentation of the Getting Played Equity Award to Clifford Alexander Jr., followed by a screening of the short Old Speller. First, let me introduce you to my co-host. Dr. Myrton Running Wolf holds a master's degree from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts and the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, as well as a PhD in Theater and Performance Studies from Stanford University. As a performer, Myrton held lead roles in stage productions in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as supporting roles in several feature films, including The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, The New World, and Into the West. Behind the scenes, Myrt worked as a creative producer for the CW and NBC, in production management for Disney ABC Television, and as a researcher tribal liaison for PBS. Welcome 2016 Getting Played Equity Award recipient, Dr. Myrton Running Wolf.
How's it going? It's so good to see you. So we're going to be watching in just a few moments a clip from a film that I wrote with my colleagues while I worked at Disney ABC Television, and some of them have gone on to get PhDs as well. Some of them are actually from our tribal lands, and some of them have gone on to be writers on successful television shows now. So there were 5 of us that worked on writing the screenplay. The screenplay went off and won a bunch of awards and became a finalist in a lot of really renowned competitions and everything else. And then we tried to get it made, and nobody wanted to tell the story of what was going on with contemporary American Indians for lots of different reasons. Basically that America still likes to control the narrative around our tribal communities, going back basically to the Buffalo Bill Wild West shows. And there's a fascination for that time period, which I get. But a lot of people, and I think that people don't get that, well, Buffalo Bill, when he did the Wild West shows, he asked people to the people that actually survived atrocities like the Wounded Knee Massacre, he asked them to be performers in the Wild West show. And these people who were starving, who had no ways of supporting themselves in a brand new society and cultural milieu, actually did. They were survivors of these Holocausts, and because to feed themselves, they actually participated in the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, took on stereotypical roles, the leather and feather show, as some people call it, and jumped around and reinforced the idea of American exceptionalism and the frontier by playing savage Indian attackers and marauders. So we wanted to change that. We wanted to talk about what was going on with contemporary Native America, the way that I grew up, coming from Browning, Montana, but also growing up in Northern Nevada and dealing with some of the social ills. But we also, having all these fancy degrees and working at all these wonderful production entities, wanted to be creative about it, wanted to kind of like say it in a way that was going to grab people's attention, push the conversation forward, and using media production, using film and television production, challenge our audience. So if you have a problem with graphic violence, provocative language, turn away for about 3.5 minutes. But if you do not, or if you actually enjoy that kind of like provocation, I invite you, hang in there. It's a movie. And it's about 3.5 minutes, the part that will do. The whole movie, if you want to see it, if you get excited enough to see the whole thing, it's just the first act of the full-length feature screenplay that we wrote. It's 20 minutes long, and it's at www.blackwarriormovie.com. I sound like I'm selling it now, but maybe I am. But you can check out the whole thing there, but we're just going to show the first 3.5 minutes-ish or so. Hey everybody! So thank you so much for indulging me and letting allowing you to show that. Recently, I showed a movie, Native American written, directed, and produced movie called Smoke Signals, which is crazy that it was actually produced and premiered in 1998, which means it's been 23 years since that movie came out. The only Native American authored, written, directed, and produced film to get national distribution, to get mainstream distribution, 23 years ago. A lot of what we're dealing with is this dominance of wanting to say, well, we know what's best for you people. And so what we see right now, sadly, is that we have other people of color, other filmmakers, minority filmmakers. So right now we have Ava DuVernay, who is writing and producing a series for NBC called Sovereign, which basically she has taken the place of the white savior coming in to tell the Native American story. Unfortunately, Taika Waititi is doing the same thing, and he's doing one for FX called Reservation Dogs, to where I guess the sentiment being Native America doesn't know how to tell its own stories, which is truly unfortunate. But the justification for this gets into this idea of anti-intellectualism. So just a few definitions I wanted to share with you guys. I actually looked up this morning on Merriam-Webster.com. Intellect, the power of knowing as distinguished from the power to feel and to will. The capacity for knowledge, the capacity for rational thought, especially when highly developed. One of the things that I think that we kind of check out on when we think about how Native American populations function within mainstream media is my students that I showed smoke signals to, the Sundance film from 1998, were surprised because they thought, oh, good, we get to see the Wild West. And then they saw that it was contemporary and they were fascinated by the film, but it worked outside of what they knew. It's changed what they felt and what their emotions went to, and it forced an intellectual engagement. I want to keep going on some of these definitions really quick, just to give us some baseline. And again, dictionary definitions, not always the most reliable. We need to challenge them, but I'm going to go there anyway. Intellectual, given to study, reflection, and speculation, developed or guided by intellect rather than by emotion or experience. A colleague of mine was told, and I actually was told by the same studio executive, actually the person that ran Sony Pictures at the time, that he didn't want to put forth any stories about Native Americans that violated the romantic fantasies that he wanted to put forth to his children. So he was guided by emotion and experience rather than intellect, was not tolerant of actually thinking about how to see marginalized populations other than their stereotypical depictions and traditional depictions. Anti-intellectual, opposing or hostile to intellectuals or to an intellectual view or approach. And I think that a lot of us know when we actually have any kind of like interactions with studio executives. So I was at a studio, and I wish I could name it, but I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, to not name them. But when I got in there, and it was their diversity, equity, and inclusion time of the year, and they sat down, they're going to give us some wonderful, what do they call those metrics? They're vanity metrics. So they're going to give us this whole like spiel on how great they're doing. And I had read their report. Native America was decreasing. And somehow they read in my face that I didn't buy into their vanity metrics. And the guy who was in charge looked at me, he's like, well, what's the matter? Who are you? Didn't know who I was. And so I started saying, yeah, I'm Myrton Running Wolf. I got a master's from USC Film School. I got another master's from NYU Tisch. I got my PhD from Stanford. And he said, hey, ho, do not wave your resume in our faces. And I was like, oh, okay. Okay. So the idea of disrupting this kind of parade of American exceptionalism or altruism that we see that's going to happen in this year's Oscars tomorrow, of saying, oh, things are so much better, actually conflicts with data from USC, UCLA, GLAD, Columbia University, where the data is showing, yes, maybe the complexion of what we see in terms of the cast is actually getting better. But when we look behind the scenes, the writers, the directors, the producers, and the studio executives, they actually do not reflect the type of diversity that is displayed in our populations. And one last thing that I want to read for you, which is from the 1964 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction book by Richard Hofstadter. I hope I said that right. Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And this is what he has to say. Anti-intellectualism is historically embedded in America's national fabric, an outcome of European colonization. It is a resentment in the life of the mind and those who are considered to represent it, a disposition to constantly minimize the value of life. Intellectuals are pretentious, conceited, and snobbish, very likely immoral, dangerous, and subversive. Man's common sense is an adequate substitute for, if not superior to, formal knowledge and expertise. And some people have said, some scholars and critics have said that the presidential administration that we just left behind in 2020 was a marker of such thought, of anti-intellectual thought, especially when that former president would make an indictment of a discipline like critical race theory because it was disrupting the fabric of America. So thank you guys for being here. We'll get into some more discussions about these things. I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have. And now I'm going to turn it back to Kathleen to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much, Myrt. I want to introduce Tatiana Lee, who is an award-winning actress, international model, and activist. Growing up in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, Lee felt unseen in popular media, and when she told people of her ambitions to be an actress and model, they laughed. Notwithstanding, Lee moved to Los Angeles to pursue her acting career. She learned to harness social media's power to speak boldly about accessibility and inclusion in mass media due to the lack of access and opportunities for herself and others with disabilities. Please read her full bio on the Getting Played website. Take it away, Tatiana Lee.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm getting emotional. And I'm going to set a timer so I don't talk too much. So my name is Tatiana Lee, like you said, and I am a Black woman. I am wearing glasses. I have my hair in a ponytail, and I'm wearing a green dress with red lipstick. Thank you so much, Dr. Kathleen and Dr. Myrt, for inviting me to be here to speak. I am an actor, a model, an activist, and I have a plethora of information and so many things that I could talk about in terms of the industry and how I've navigated this industry for the past 5 or 6 years, 5+ years, let me say. But I think before I get started and tell you kind of just how I've navigated this industry, I think it's important for me to talk about how it all started. So, next slide, please. I was born to a single mother, and I was born with a disability called spina bifida. And when I was 7 years old, actually, before I was even 7 years old, the doctors told my mom, don't expect anything from me. She won't be able to talk, she won't be able to walk, she won't be able to do anything for herself, and she pretty much will probably be dependent on you for the rest of your life, for her life. I was 7 years old. I learned how to walk with the aid of crutches. I went to school, did so many amazing things. And at 7 years old, I knew what I wanted to do. My mom said that I used to say I wanted to be an actor, a model, and an entrepreneur. Well, I said I wanted to own my own gummy bear factory. So she knew I had an entrepreneurial spirit. And one of the first things I did on my 7th birthday was my mom bought me a Polaroid camera. I organized a photo shoot in my front yard with crafty and production, the whole thing. So I knew what I was getting into, and my mom knew the ambitions that I was going to have as an adult. Actually, one of those photos of me in the denim is that very photo from that very first photo shoot. And yeah, so I continued to pursue, wanting to model. I have so many tons of photos of me just being in front of the camera, playing in makeup, playing in beauty. And I spent a lot of time in the hospital. I've had numerous surgeries to correct the deformities of my feet due to my spina bifida. And I spent a lot of time in the hospital consuming content, consuming TV, film, magazines. And one of the things that I noticed was I couldn't identify with any of it. I could not look at anything and see myself. I barely saw Black women, let alone a Black woman with a disability. It was non-existent. And so I set out to want to pursue a career in the industry. When I was in middle school, I wanted to do theater. And the school said to me, oh no, you have learning disabilities. You can't waste your time trying to do theater or anything like that. Focus on your academics, focus on your academics. And I couldn't do theater. I wanted to do journalism club. Oh no, that's too much extracurriculars for you. Just focus on your core academics so that you can get by. Everywhere I turned to try to express myself and use my voice, I was turned away or denied and told that that wasn't for me. I was in 10th grade, high school, and trying to do all that I could. By that time, I've had over 20 different surgeries and meningitis 2 times and so many different things going on. And when you are a child that is going through education with a disability, you have what is called an IEP, an individualized education plan. And the IEP team that you had as a teacher, guidance counselor, your parent, and they're supposed to work out ways to help you further your education. They sat my mother and I down in 10th grade and said to me, we don't think she's going to be able to finish everything that she needs to finish. And we don't know how to help her. So we think her best option is to drop out. So just like that, in 10th grade, I was a high school dropout. I learned everything I could to study to get my GED. Had some friends help me learn math because math was my struggle. I have learning disabilities, ADHD, dyslexia, and dyscalculia, which makes it hard for me to comprehend numbers. Had a friend help me with math. I completed my GED with flying colors. I then from there went on to college, majored in business marketing, branding. At that point, my goal was I wanted to create my own magazine and my own platform to showcase disability. And I wanted to put myself in it because I wanted to model and act and do all these awesome things that everyone kept telling me wasn't for me. And I still didn't see representation of myself. And I used to think people with disabilities didn't want to work in the industry. I didn't know that later on I would find out that there were actual barriers to people with disabilities being in the industry. And just to tell you some stats of, because later on in this work that I'm doing, I realized that everything that happened to me was very common among people born with their disability. Only 65% of people with disabilities finish high school at no fault of their own. So a huge percentage of the dropout rate are people with disabilities not getting the support that they need. And only 7% of people born with their disability complete college at no fault of their own because no one wants to make things accessible and accommodating to people with disabilities. And because of that, only 1 in 3 people with disabilities have a job. I went on to try to get a job after finishing college. I never got to finish college because I just could not get that math. I tried to get a job at a movie theater collecting tickets. No one would hire me. I tried to get a job at a grocery store, bagging things. No one would hire me. So I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania, and I said, you know what? I'm going to figure this out. Hollywood's probably way more inclusive and accessible than this small town. Let me go and see what happens. So one day I got up, I hopped on a plane, and I moved to LA. Moved to LA, still tried to do the same thing, get a job at a movie theater, beauty stores. No one would hire me. So I said, you know what? I'm going to try acting and give it a shot. I would go to open castings. I would go to auditions, so many different things. And I would have other women in line say, oh my gosh, good for you. You are so brave. And I would say, what is the difference between me pursuing a career and you? No different. But people thought a girl in a wheelchair trying to model was something so brave to try to accomplish. So I would then go to networking events and try to network because anybody who works in the industry, you know, it's not about always what you know, it's always about who you know, right? So I would go to networking events and I had a friend who had connections and, you know, had a publicist and would invite me to all these amazing events that had like the who's who of people. And I would show up and I could not get in the room physically. It was not wheelchair accessible. I would call and say, are you wheelchair accessible? I would have people say, I don't know. Or I think we are. Or no, we don't do that. Well, when I got to LA wasn't as inclusive and accessible as I thought it was going to be. And then that's when I realized that it wasn't that people with disabilities didn't want to work in the industry. It was that they literally could not get into the room. And so I set out to educate people. So I started a brand called accessiblehollywood.com. And what I did was I just blogged about it. I would talk about my experiences. If I would go to events, I would write about it. And if it was accessible, I would critique it. I would go off. I would say, this is what you're doing wrong. This is who you're leaving out. And this is the problem it is having. And at that same time, I met a community of people who were others with disabilities who had been knocking down doors to work in this industry for a long, long time. And I knew I had found my community of people because we all wanted the same thing. We just wanted a shot to work in the industry. And then I sat down and met this woman who was amazing. And she was telling me her struggles of working in this industry. And she was a white woman. And I was like, oh my gosh, if she can't have access, what are they going to do with me? So in my advocacy work, I ended up booking my first modeling job. I ended up booking a modeling job. Next slide, please. I ended up booking a modeling job for Apple. And that was a really, really great opportunity and opened up so much more for me. I started getting lots of auditions. I signed with my agent. So many great things happened for me. I ended up winning the Christopher Reeves Scholarship and honored me and saying that I was making such stride in this industry and getting so much attention. And people were like, who's this girl? But I still could not get booked for a major role or anything like that. I did tons of short films, won awards for my short films that had gone on to do disability film festivals, but I still couldn't get anything any bigger. I then went on and started working and advocating in this space, doing speaking engagements like this, just using my voice to really try to make some change and make some leadway. Now, because of the work that I've been able to do, I like to think I had a little bit to do with it. Disability representation has gotten a little bit better. But one of the things that's really important is people don't always talk about the intersection of being Black and disabled. Now, we've had a tumultuous year with the whole Black Lives Matter movement and all of the things that have happened, which it is not new to us. I'm glad it's getting more attention, but I'm honestly exhausted and so much more needs to be done. But a lot of things that people don't want to acknowledge is that 50% of those people that have gotten widespread attention for being killed by police, including Sandra Bland and Elijah McClain and so many others, are Black and disabled. And just some stats here to tell you the difference in employment and high school graduation rate between being disabled and being Black and disabled. And you're more likely to be brought into the school to prison pipeline for being Black and disabled, and how disability is very much always criminalized, especially in the Black community. And that's why my advocacy is so important. And that's why representation of being Black and disabled is so important. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about how, you know, when not having the right access and opportunities makes so much more compounded problems in society. Next slide, please. Back one. So, disability representation. So right now I work for an amazing nonprofit and I get to work as a consultant in the entertainment industry to help shift the narrative of what it means to be disabled. So some stats that I always tell, and alarming, people with disabilities, we make up 20 to 25% of the population. And that also includes mental health, which includes ADHD, dyslexia, mental health, depression, anxiety, are all protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. When it comes to disability representation on screen, we only make up 3.1% of what you see in media. Now, actors without disabilities play more than 95% of those roles. And this is something I constantly advocate for. We even have someone in the Oscars this weekend about to possibly win an award who's nominated for an Oscar for playing disabled and them themselves not being disabled. And we in the disability community call that cripping up or crip face, which we see it as no different than someone doing blackface or someone depicting someone trans that is cisgendered, or somebody that is female or supposed to be female and playing male. So it's the same difference when we see someone who is not disabled playing disabled, and someone is, again, nominated for an Oscar for portraying someone being deaf. And not only that, almost all portrayals of people with disabilities are white, despite the fact that disability affects every and all demographic. You can never talk about any marginalized group or any group for that matter and not talk about disability. So with that, I've been able to advocate and really talk about this, and we have so much more work to do. And then another study just came out a couple months ago. The Gina Davis Institute did a study on representation of Black women. And they included disability. They included the representation of Black women and disabled Black women, which I thought was great because no one ever talks about the representation of disabled Black women. Guess what that number is? 0.0%. I've been doing this work, advocating in this industry for more than 5 years, and the representation of disabled Black women is still at 0.0%. And we still don't do disability representation authentically. So my work is so much very necessary to do to change the narrative so that we can understand and tell these stories of what it means to, you know, have a disability and go through education and employment and all the barriers, and including being killed by the police, and how important telling those stories are. Next slide, please. Since I've been doing this work, I've been featured in so many different magazines and really doing a lot of activism, and it's been great. But one of the things that I want to say is, I really hope I get to the point where there's no need for my activism, that everyone just intentionally includes disability, and it's not going to just happen by accident. We have to be very, very intentional. Like today, having an ASL interpreter and having access for people with disabilities, because it's not that just, there's actual physical barriers. And me as an actor, I've been told so many odd things of, oh, that's too many, you know, compounded identities to bring at once to any role. I've literally been told that. I've been told being disabled is enough. We don't want to compound on being being Black and also being a woman. And then I've had friends who also say, well, we also don't want to depict of being Black, being disabled, and also being trans. Like, but those are the people that are affected the most. So I want to say, one of the things that in the disability community, we say nothing about us without us. And that goes in everything. And that starts with media representation in the industry. So when you think about projects that you're doing, think about the compounded identities of being disabled, and make sure you are telling those disabled stories, because they're so important towards really shifting society and what we see. So I have a couple more minutes. I'm making good time. Thank you so much. I'm excited. I'm saying thank you to myself because I'm like, I'm staying on topic and on time. But think about including people with disabilities behind the camera, in front of the camera. And I work for an awesome organization and work for as a consultant. So if you're looking for disabled filmmakers, disabled writers, disabled animators, all of those things, they are out there and ready to work. Just they don't get the opportunity or the chance because they're literally left out of the industry. So as you move forward in anything that you're working on, please think about that as we move forward, and don't forget about those multiple identities, because we are so left out of those conversations. I want to say thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this space to tell my story, to talk about the landscape of disability representation and what is needed for us to be able to move forward. Is to include people with disabilities in telling those stories. Thank you so much. My name is Tatiana Lee, and I appreciate the space. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. That was so fantastic. You made me laugh. You made me mist up. It was really incredible. I appreciate so much that you shared that with us and gave us all of that information and things to think about, which is really wonderful. Dr. Running Wolf, are you available to introduce our lovely panel?
Yes, yes, definitely. And I would love it if they would introduce themselves. But I do have questions for all of our panels. So I'm just going to run down their names, and then when I ask you to go ahead and contribute, if you can, we would love to hear not only your thoughts on the question I'm going to ask, but also just tell us about your background, who you are, and then kind of just your general thoughts on some of this stuff. We are trying to do it a little bit more of a conversation. If you have a more formal stuff, then please, by all means, feel free to do that. But I think that both Kathleen and I are really interested in problem solving these things. And I think that we both kind of get frustrated sometimes with the kind of like the formality of these discussions that seem to have, they go around and around and around, and we don't have any solutions. And just to kind of like let people in that don't know, so in the mid 1990s, NAACP and other advocates like the Reverend Jesse Jackson said that there was a diversity wasteland in mainstream media production. And that's when a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, although they didn't call it that, a lot of those programs began in the mid 1990s, which means we're 26, almost 3 decades into this issue. And we still have so much room to go. So we have with us on our panel today, Rebecca Murga, Nikko Kimzin. I apologize if I am butchering your names, Michelle Kantor and Margaret Lake. But I want to start with Rebecca Murga. So Rebecca, my friend, can you introduce yourself? And then if you're comfortable, can you please share your thoughts on the idea that mainstream film, television, and theater are merit-based? So basically the people that get the golden ticket to play are the best of the best. And if that is the case, if it is a merit-based system, how does a poor kid from the barrio, from the hood, from the res, from the ghetto, how do they gain access into this celebrated space of media production, whether that's film, television, or theater?
Well, to quickly answer your question, yes, everything in Hollywood is fair and equitable. No, it's not. And I will quickly introduce myself, and so you understand kind of my intersectionality of how I enter this space. As Dr. Running Wolf said, I grew up a poor kid from Chicago. My father was a Guatemalan immigrant who came to this country. My mother is Puerto Rican. And I spent a long time trying to figure out, there was this industry that I loved because I grew up watching television. And kids from my neighborhood didn't become writers or directors. And so, I ended up moving to the East Coast and working in sports. I was producing on the East Coast for the Orioles home and away games, loved sports production, and then 9/11 happened. So I ended up sidetracked and spent about 10 years in the military. I served in the military during Iraq, during Afghanistan, during Don't Ask, Don't Tell, during prior to the female combat exclusion policy. And so my lens, I always say I'm a very different person from when I entered the military. My lens when I came back, having spent a lot of time with women in conflict zones, and really educating the populace on why it was important to listen to women in specific countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and Africa. I realized that I would come back to the States and the narrative of how immigrants were being spoken about, of how I would come back and people didn't even realize there was a war taking place until I would show them my photography, until I would tell them a story. And all of a sudden they were engaged and they were interested. And so, I decided to move down to Los Angeles to pursue writing and directing, which a friend of mine said, you survived 2 wars. How hard can Hollywood be? That's what he said to me. So I came down to Los Angeles and realized that there were more women deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan that were directing in Hollywood. I realized as a Latin woman that even that number was so abysmal. And I did a lot of programs. I did the AFI directing program. I did the ABC directing program. I currently run the AFI directing program, helping BIPOC, LGBTQIA filmmakers pave a way from this industry. And so I come to you from the perspective that when I speak to some of these filmmakers and see them doing the right things, right? I know filmmakers who have gone to Sundance and who have premiered at Sundance and then spent 10 years trying to find a job. I know filmmakers, Black filmmakers who have done the same thing, went to Tribeca, went to multiple films at these places and still could not get a job in the industry. Because they were told that their work was too niche. Their work was from a point of view that was just way too different. And when I started going into these meetings with large studio executives who said on one hand, and who were so vocal about tweeting about Black Lives Matter, but would not hire some filmmakers who were going in to tell these stories. And so I had to start really peeling back the layer of where was the disconnect between being able to state that, yes, I'm for diversity, and yes, I'm for, and these are incredible programs that are there to help writers and directors and actors. I also, I'm a director for the ABC Casting Showcase, where, ABC and Disney are committed to diversity. But the problem was doing these programs and directing these programs and then looking at what happens when a career stalls. That to me was what I wanted to focus on, because the numbers, when numbers started coming out, when you saw the Gina Davis Foundation and you saw the reports, in fact, I just saw a report now, right, where they state that, this is the title of the article that came out. Diversity of film cast skyrocketed in 2020. And deep within the article, Latinx performers were cast in 5% of roles last year. They make up 18% of the population, and they account for 30% of tickets sold and actual buyers for Netflix. And so when I would see reports like this come out, and then Netflix, recently said, well, we're going to throw $100 million at the problem. I don't think they're really identifying what the problem is. The problem is that these filmmakers are out there. I see them because I work in some of these spaces. The problem is they're not being hired, because the status quo says, well, we'll tell Latin stories, but we're going to hire this experienced white director who's a cis white male to tell that story because he has the experience in telling it. What they don't tell you is that when you look at some of these experienced directors, I loved Spielberg growing up. I was a huge fan of E.T. What they don't tell you is that Spielberg at 21 was given the agency to work in a studio system and make television shows and hone that craft. And what I don't see is these studio systems investing the time in artists, in the time that it's going to take to create those artists. And I think that's my frustration, is that you realize it takes a long time to create an artist, from the time they get into the system to the time they get their Sundance film, and in the 10 years it'll take for them to actually get hired. But studio systems, instead of saying, well, it's on us to start creating and curating artists like they did in the past with the Spielbergs, with the Lucases, they don't do that anymore. And so they say, well, it's the content drives it all. And that's not the case, And so I feel like there's a lot of fear sometimes in some of these positions of hiring or of power, in not wanting to take a chance on an up and coming director. And I say to that, then things will never change. If you are going to continuously find the status quo director to tell diverse stories, it will take hundreds of years to change. And I always say this, you know, when we talk about equity, because I hear this all the time from, I run a veterans group. And in that group, we work a lot with disabled and able-bodied veterans from all different walks of life. And, you know, I say to that group that in this industry, you know, equity isn't hiring, you know, a few more people of color or a few more women. Specifically with women, I feel like equity is realizing that over the last 100 years, 90% of most of the jobs in this industry were placed by men. Real equity is for the next 100 years, hiring 99% women in those jobs, you know, disabled, LGBTQIA, people of color in those positions. And then on the 100th year, we can start talking across the board of evening out those numbers. But that's just a few thoughts. I was so kind of motivated, Tatiana, by what you had to say, and really kind of looked at it from my lens in working with not only disabled veterans, but you know, invisible disabilities like PTSD and other things. And so I truly have seen, you know, I've had screenings at the DGA and have had asked the question about accessibility for things, and have had, you know, myself, even over the last few years, people say, well, you know, I think so. I think we can service wheelchairs. And that's not good enough. That's not good enough. Specifically because I think we, you know, again, I work in the veteran space. So this young man, this young Black man who has no legs for serving this country now can't go into a theater because you haven't thought about it. And that's not good enough, you know, and there are kind ways to do it, but I think we just have to be really firm in we are demanding change, and as we should, there things should be equitable across the board. So just some thoughts on what I had.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Oh my goodness. So much to unpack. Yeah. And I wish, oh gosh, yeah, I wish I could continue on with all these different like amazing experiences that everybody has. But I do want to bring in some of our other panelists. Nikko, I would like to jump to you. So if you can, in the same way, can you introduce yourself? But the question that I have for you is, do we need a new definition of what a diversity initiative, whether that's theater, whether that's film, whether that's screenwriting, whether that's working at the studio, do we need a new definition of what success means for a diversity initiative? And what I mean by that is, we know that there is still a lot of improvement that needs to be done. However, I think that especially during this award season, we see, you know, these kind of vanity metrics, these kind of like self-congratulatory performances. And I'm wondering, is that how we should be looking at success? What I mean by that, a complicated question, I guess I'm making it more complicated than it needs to be. Is the success of the diversity initiatives to quiet down the marginalized populations without changing anything? So we have an initiative, we have a screenwriting program, we have some casting stuff that goes on, and the success of a diversity initiative is not necessarily more diversity, more equity, and more inclusion, but to shut those people up. So yeah, I talk this way sometimes. So sometimes I say things that are a little rough to hear, but truly I think that way, that sometimes it feels that way, that the diversity initiative is not really about improving things. It's just to shut people up. So Nikko, please introduce yourself and let us know your thoughts.
Amen to all that. You were all lucky that I was on mute for the past with Tatiana and Rebecca here spitting wisdom, because I am a mooer. I go, So I was shouting you down in my moos. My name is Nikko Kimzin. I am a queer Latinx creative producer and arts educator. And going back to that question, Dr. Myrton, that is exactly what I was kind of writing in my crazy frantic notes here, is what is the definition of success when we see these merit-based programs, right, that are allegedly earned, right? Is that the carrot in front of white supremacy that is upholding a system that we should be running towards, that was created without us in mind, to keep us in place, to keep us operating in a system that they have created? So to your thing, yes, we need a new definition, we need a new system. right? We need a new merit of how we define success. And I think where that goes into my ing of Rebecca was to say, this all begins, as opposed to Netflix creating a system and throwing $100 million at DEI statements to shut up the PR that is happening, you know, to their organizations, is to say this begins in education. Right? If we're really looking to create a holistic approach to the arts ecosystem that really begins in creating a new system that is anti-racist, right? Is then to say, let's invest in arts education. And where we see the beginnings of anti-intellectualism is in education, where it's not funded, where they're not given agency, where they're not given voice, where it's art for art's sake, right? It's escapism at the beginning, saying your art shouldn't matter. It should just be pretty. It shouldn't say anything. There should be no depth. How dare we give our generation coming up the tools to express themselves when we know artists are the creators of culture, and what would happen if we really gave them the tools to create this new culture that dissembles white supremacy and builds a more inclusive, loving culture. That's the fear that is withholding funding from arts education, right? Is that they want to keep people dumb, keep people uninformed and without resources and tools to create new systems, because artists are the creators of these new systems. So of course, we're gonna not fund arts education, right? So to me, it's this holistic approach. Netflix, all these organizations, if you're really just not about the PR and you wanna change the system, why don't you start with investing in education and let this new generation that is informed develop what success looks like and what this new system of how we get to that definition of success looks like.
That's amazing. That's amazing. One of the things that, and I resist sometimes doing academic conferences because years ago, I was at one at UCLA that had to do with theater. And myself and another Native American performer, we were coming out of, got our undergraduate degrees, and we were like, great, we're going to go to this academic conference and we're going to get some information on how we can actually begin our careers. And it was full of just a bunch of like rhetorical stuff talking about stuff that really didn't have any pragmatic application. It was just kind of like fancy ideas. And at the end, we kind of aired our grievances, and then everybody went home. And myself and my friend, his name is Jake Hart, we were like, dude, we came here to actually like make change, to actually start our careers, to tell stories about Native America. And we point blank asked them, what do we do to launch our careers? And they had no answers to us. So I would want to kind of like ask you the same question: is, if you're a kid from the barrio, if you're from the res, if you're from the ghetto, if you're from the hood, what can I do given the system that needs to change? But I'm not a power broker, I'm not a decision maker yet. How do I, as somebody that's coming out, I'm 23, 24, 25, I just got my college degree, how do I begin my career in a system that seems oblivious to some of the challenges, and willfully oblivious to some of the challenges?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
How would you begin if you were just coming out and kind of out of being conditioned in these systems, right? Exactly. So to me, it's beginning with this original question you asked is, what is the definition of success? And I think going back to your original question, merit based on mass consumption, right? Which means mass consumption to white America. So I think when we talk about theater from the theater lens, I come from the theater world, honey, if you can't tell, there are regional theaters that are regional for a reason. They are audience regionally specific, right? To curate stories that a community needs to hear, needs to explore. So I think beginning with this new lens of definition and being target focused to an audience to say, if my definition is collective impact and community change, that's here, that's local. And let me operate and use and get to know that muscle here. And then I can work and be in a larger arena of how I create change that is disassociated from capitalism, right, and white supremacy. But if I know how to uplift local communities here that are of my experience, then I can do that in larger categories and arenas. And I think by then we start to shift the move away from money and capitalism to collective impact and greater transformation.
Excellent, excellent. And I'm wondering, and this kind of broadens out beyond just kind of like the person that's just graduating, how do we do this? Because what you're talking about is this kind of like epistemological shift of, well, the way that we see our industries working, that they're not capitalism, they're about creating community, they're about shifting it to not the individual kind of narcissist that's just like, I'm a visionary genius, or however we tout that. And I have the thing and I need to get myself out there, not to beat up on social media, but okay, we can a little bit. But the idea being that the purpose of our work, the intent of our work is to actually create community. How do you see shifting that from this capitalistic model to this idea of this is how we improve community? Because we so need it right now. I got to be honest, like a lot of the problems that I see, even if you're just talking about wearing your mask, right? Just going out to the grocery store and wearing a mask, it's like people in America seem right now, anti-maskers are just like, you can't tell me what to do. I'm just like, it's not about you. It's not about you, homie. It's about a community and taking care of each other. How do we make that shift?
Yeah, I think there's incredible devices there, the shift from the me to the we, right? And if we really look at these visionaries in the theater, they were all created by a community, whether they're willing to admit it or not. Right. And I think it comes from a collective approach, right? We look at different producing models. Now there's the producer, there's the director, there's the choreographer, right? There are other alternatives to creating art in different cultures and communities that we can learn from. That comes from a commons approach where everyone has an equal seat at the table, and we're moving via intent, not impact, and we will collectively move through there, right? Emergent Strategy, this is my thing, drop the book, Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Maree Brown, everybody look it up, go for it. But as we look at different producing models to dismantle this idea of hierarchy, right? That it's a collective storytelling medium and everybody brings their gifts to the table. So I think we have to first look at how we create the thing, right? That will then set us up for new producing structures to move forward. And that is, to me, education and learning what other cultures can bring to the storytelling platforms, because storytelling is intrinsic in the human experience wherever you are. And it's not just Hollywood, baby. And it's not just white. So we really, if America's really going to do American history, then we really got to talk about who's been here telling stories for centuries and learn from their storytelling models, because I think that's going to inform these new structures that we build.
So amazing. So amazing. Thank you, Nikko. I'm going to shift down to Michelle. Michelle, if you can, again, you guys are wonderful. I'm so like, I too, I'm just like, but Michelle, if you can introduce yourself. And then the question for you that I would like kind of hear yours is, a lot of like producers, whether that's film, television, or theater producers, kind of take a position that, oh yeah, well, we're good. The problem is those guys over there. Like, yeah, we're all for diversity, equity, inclusion, but it's over there. How do we kind of rework the question to say, wait a second, if we're really going to make an improvement, we all have to take ownership of being part of the issue, part of the challenge, part of the problem. How do we get producers who are like, yeah, we're doing it right, man, but nothing's changing? How do we get that? How do we shift their mindset?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I'm Michelle. I'm a filmmaker, and I'm the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Cinefem, and we are a fiscal sponsor. So yeah, I'll get into that a little bit. But my background is I'm from Colorado. My family escaped from communist Czechoslovakia in the 60s. So I'm first generation American. My first movie in the theater was Pale Rider. Apparently I was 2 months old and my dad took me. So I always loved movies, and I've had epilepsy most of my life. So just as a person with an invisible disability, I think that lent to a lot of what would you say? A lot of hours spent watching movies and creating my own, worlds and whatnot. So I ended up going to film school at University of Colorado Boulder, and it's a real avant-garde experimental school. So I got to study under Stan Brakhage and just really have creative and intellectual freedom that was really grounded in the the art of film. And so sadly, like, you know, I did get my master's too, but there is a real, you know, chasm between the corporate Hollywood model and the art that it needs to sustain itself, the artist. So with that in mind, as I was set to graduate with a couple of my other film school friends, we did look at the statistics and saw that at the time it was something, I think it was 2% of women were directors above the line in major Hollywood films. So we created a 501c3. I went to a used bookstore in San Francisco in the Mission and picked up a copy of the NOLO Guide to Starting a Nonprofit. This was sort of before that got a little bit easier. And we did it to funnel our thesis films through. And at that time, I was also really interested in seeing representation that I wanted to see personally, which was a woman with epilepsy. And so I, you know, wrote and directed and almost acted in, but did not, a film which you know, shows epilepsy in a creative way from an epileptic's point of view. So, you know, that was just one of the ways that we were trying to create our own ladder, our own tools of, if not disruption at that time, just, you know, leverage or power, and, you know, try to advance our stories forward and do some activism you know, at the same time. So, you know, since then, I've worked with over 50 projects. So we've fiscally sponsored over 50 short films, feature films, film festivals, various kind of new media or intellectual pursuits, things like that. And the caliber of storytelling that comes to Cinefem, because they don't have, you know, very many other resources or tools, it's pretty cool. And I'm really proud of just having been able to give some kind of, I guess, tool to help advance this really important need for just, I mean, we really have the biggest propaganda weapon in the world. And I think that's like part of why I hate Hollywood. I will just be frank. I'm not a fan of Los Angeles. I like, you know, I like architecture. I like more than one season. And it's a shitty business. It's really fun, but it's all over the place. It was certainly not built for disabled people. It's not even built for healthy people. Production hours are, you know, 12-hour, if not more days. And it's really hard on the body. And I've had to create such a weird career of kind of finagling, not really talking about my epilepsy, but making sure I don't have to drive at 6 a.m. to a call. And it's tough. And I think a lot of people, whether, you know, they are facing, you know, the potential of discrimination, either by virtue of their sex or their ability, physical ability or race, like we just, you know, I think you have to get creative as you dismantle the systems that just were not like built for you to succeed in. And what was your question again? I feel like it had to do oligarchy, not the meritocracy we are currently.
Right. The idea, and basically kind of, and I could return to that, in hearing you speak, it actually makes me want to lean on you for some advice. So my question shifts now, and I think it's kind of in the same place. But so when I went to this big Hollywood studio and was there for their annual diversity kind of like parade that they do of how awesome they're doing, they use vanity metrics. We're doing all this wonderful stuff. And then I said, well, wait a second, I read your report and it's not true. So basically the idea of the question I originally asked you was like, when you have producers or you have these entities that are like, we're doing such a great job, and then you look at it and you're like, actually, you're not. How do you get them so then I did that. They said, basically, they told me to shut up and know my place. What would your advice be to me? So I'm still kind of like reeling from it. So I have Hollywood that says, we're doing a great job. I'm like, yeah, I looked at the data. I did the intellectual thing, and your data doesn't support what you're saying to my face right now. What would your advice be to somebody, to all of us who see the data doesn't match with the rhetoric coming out of the Hollywood system? And how do we persevere? How do we go on? How do we succeed in the face of these powerful industries, these powerful people, these decision makers who are saying, no problem here? What would your advice to me be in that situation?
Well, public shaming is always effective, and before you have laws that can really bring, corporations to account, like public shaming. A lot of these, I've been working towards, creating pipelines with various studios and production companies for the last few years. And a lot of what I've found is that it's performative, and it's also built like kind of, they have their little diversity room, and they'll, create maybe a festival, but nothing is actually going to materially improve the job prospects or the resources available to any of the human beings that they're offering it to. So it ends up, being not very useful and basically just a PR, gimmick. And they can't, I think like as not only just creators, but consumers, we can't like allow that kind of just real unaccountability. And so like what you're asking is almost a social thing where you have to use your allies, your men like Paul Feig, who will like step aside and get, people into the room and get money behind them and I think he had some initiative where he was getting native LA creators from different neighborhoods to tell their own stories and giving them the money. It's what people need is money, but these guys who are also hypocritical and who are not like making sure that they ensure below the line diversity, like a lot of that's union too, don't you think? Is that like without permeating the unions and making sure we have more than 5 female grips available, and so Cinefem, we opened up a membership a few years ago and created a community space beyond our fiscal sponsorship model in order to oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. What was I
No worries. I was actually writing down something that you brought up in terms of like the unions, and it also gets me thinking about the agencies.
I'm sorry,
but go ahead. Yeah.
So anyway, we opened up our membership to not just directors, producers, and writers, because our focus in fiscal sponsorship were the 3 above the line roles, so that because it's, we're lacking diversity because they do the hiring. So the more we opened it up to below the line so that you're creating those relationships, because it's these producers don't have relationships with, people that don't look like them, and so I think like it's the personal bonds that you might be also running up against, is that like it's a culture that we're also attempting to, really kind of permeate and make less inaccessible in terms of our ability to really like mingle and not. So
yeah,
I guess, I don't know, that's just a couple ideas though.
No, thank you so much, because I think that what you bring up, what I heard a lot of was the kind of like the idea of the performative diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, or the PR campaign that's going, and for people to be aware that these things they do have that sense of artifice or public relations, that they're not done to transform the system, as Nikko was talking about, but they're made to almost preserve the system. And the idea then would be to try to find allies who are truly, like you mentioned, Paul Feig, who are truly making these types of investments in what transformative change actually looks like. Transformative change, is that redundant? Probably. Thank you so much. I need to move on, Michelle, to Margaret. Margaret, so same thing, please. introduce yourself, tell us all about all the stuff that you're up to. One of the things that I want you to kind of like help us understand though is a lot of the old production practices and traditions, they worked for a reason. They were successful in terms of the way that film, television producers, Broadway producers were like, that's success. And even today, I think that audiences still kind of gravitate toward some of these familiar narrative structures. The white male is the hero. The dark-skinned person is going to be the evildoer. And in order to change this system and change these kind of like very antiquated, going all the way back to like the idea of the antagonist and protagonist assignment, producers today are like, you know what, this is going to take too much work. It's going to take too much research. We don't have the experience to do that. And then if we don't have the knowledge or the experience, we got to hire a bunch of strangers that we've never worked with. How do we break that cycle of the old guard saying, man, this is too much work and we're good with the success that we already have?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you to everybody for having me here. And Myrton, I actually, I grew up in Utah and I remember your film at Sundance, and I just appreciate you. For me, I mean, before I get into the question, I just wanted to say, so my whole life, I would say I'm a disruptor, and I don't understand a lot of times how systems work, why they work. You know, my favorite answer to a question is, well, why do you do it this way? And the answer is always, well, we've always done it that way. And that just drives me crazy. But I grew up in Utah, an artist and a writer. If my dad didn't sell a painting, I didn't get new shoes. So I was very aware of art and money and who's in control of it. And I said to my dad one time, I can't believe your gallery dealer takes 50%. And he said, well, I don't know the people that buy the painting, so I can either get 50 or 0. And as a kid, I was like, wow, that's, you know, the people creating are just getting screwed. But I wanted to, so as I grew up, I did artistic things. I worked for Sundance for a long time, and I'm really grateful for that. I did a radio show, and on my show, I said, they wanted me to play chick music. And I said, well, what's chick music, you know? And I was like, nobody sits at home and listens to 3 hours of the same type of music. And they said, well, but the problem is, how are you going to market it? It's like, well, I'm just going to play good music, and if people want to listen to it, they'll listen to it, and end up being the top show on the air. But they were just afraid of how to market it, which I'll get into on the distribution side. So then when I was working for Sundance, I ended up moving to Miami, working for the Miami Film Festival. I took over a historic 1926 venue. Same thing. I was like, why do we do all these things this way? Created a lot of different grant systems, got on the board of League of Historic American Theaters, was raising money for films, got brought to LA to open the theater at Ace Hotel, and thought, wow, I've made it, you know, this is it. And brought Sundance in there. And then I realized I can raise money for these buildings. And a friend of mine said, you should start raising money for films. And when I looked into it, I thought, this industry is so weird. You know, I knew nothing about the back end, and I thought, okay, so you want me to like go ask people if they'll give, you know, $50 to this film or $50 to this film because of this or that. And I just felt like I was selling watches out of a trench coat, and it just made me feel like, oh, how can I pick one over the other? This is horrible. And I realized, you know, the problem for me was like, wait a second, like nobody walks in my dad's studio and says, well, you really need to put like red right in the middle of that painting. Like, we're just not going to do it unless you put that stroke there. And I was really looking at the relationship between story and finance, and really just drilling down on like, who is in charge of this. And as I've spent, anyway, I started this company, Marwin Films, and I've really been in the research and development for probably too long. COVID happened right before we were going to get a big influx of cash, which I'm okay with because I think COVID is changing the way that we do things. But I noticed that a couple things, like one, if you're making a product, like let's say you make a shoe, you know, you don't sell your shoe to someone else to market it and then take over it and then give you back whatever they got from it. I mean, what is up with the film industry? You know, like, oh, you're gonna have this one budget, and this budget is gonna give you enough money to make a film. And then you're just gonna hope that you get into Sundance or some other place where you get into a cocktail party and you meet someone that just might know someone that might let you sell it. But P.S., it's not like you're going on tour with it. You got this one shot for this thing not to expire in that actual year. I mean, it's just, if I had known what I know now about this industry, I would have never taken this on, but I'm so upset that it's going to be my dying wish to change this. So anyway, continuing, so I started realizing, what if we fund a film and then we put more money in a different pot towards marketing it and do, co-productions with distributions? Like, it's one thing to make it, but how are people going to see it? And if somebody doesn't decide they want to put a chunk of money behind something to see it, how are people going to see it? But I mean, I'm going to go on for days, so I'm going to try to slow it down. But I saw a film that horrified me in 2013 called Seduced and Abandoned. And it's like James Tolbiac and Alec Baldwin, and they're pretending to sell a movie at Cannes and talking to people. And one of this quote that I actually could not find online, I had to watch the film because it's so damning. It does have a swear in it, so I'm just going to let you know. And it's Ron Meyer, the president and COO of Universal Studios and co-founder of CAA. As an industry, we make some shitty movies and we make some great movies. The real problem in this business, if you make a great film, you really get down to it, you make a great film that no one else gets to see versus a bad film that everyone has gone to see. The way to keep your job is to make a bad film that everyone wants to see. Now, this is a founder of this modern institutionalized industry. So I'm like, wow, you actually want to keep people in an anti-intellectual zone. Like, if you think about how many hours a day you spend, especially during COVID, watching things that are streaming, it's our currency consciousness. So if we're not committed somehow to change what gets put on a screen, like these 5 old white dudes in LA are gonna be in charge of our entire humanity, like, it terrifies me. So anyway, what I would love to do, my goal is to, restructure the deal is one thing, but to find investors that are willing to put philanthropic money into a fund that separates the money from the creativity and allows someone to actually tell the story they want to tell and to develop these artists. But not only that, people can't change their taste if they're not exposed to anything different. So, for me, I grew up a total tomboy, gay girl in Utah. I didn't see anyone like me. Maybe Freaky Friday, but I didn't know she was gay, If you can't see yourself on television or on the screen, you don't know that it's okay to be who you are. And so you can, people say to me, oh, you look like Ellen or whatever. I have like a purse and a wallet. Like, I don't want to be a stereotype. And I don't want to see a story about a stereotype. I want to see a person that is not in a box. So I think, I have a lot to say about it, but the point is that I've got a few philanthropic investors that are willing to put money behind projects so that data, it's not just a philanthropic venture. I believe these films will make more money. And I believe with the power of the dollar and our communities, we can actually guide people to say, spend your dollars in a different place. And here's the place to spend them, and here's what we need to help. And I have a lot of ideas about different ways to do distribution, but my goal as a producer, as a fundraiser, is to help people who do not have access, not go to Hollywood and get in and make it big, but create something different. And then when they see, oh my gosh, those people are making a shitload of money, they're going to say, wow, we need to rethink what we're doing. And I think that's the only way it's going to happen, but exactly. I'm going to try to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's backed up by the research that comes out of UCLA and the Bunge Center, that they are saying that, yeah, if you have a more diverse production team and diverse ideas, that you're not driving the audience away. They're actually gravitating toward it. There's actually more money to be made
There
by
is.
having innovation and different ideas there.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Now, I want to jump.
Yeah,
I want to jump in
a
second to do do some audience Q&A, but there's actually one that queues up really nicely for you. I'll say to everyone that I sort of use the bell hooks rules of engagement for Q&A, which is keep it to 60 seconds, and I will interrupt you if I need you to cut it down a little bit. But I think it actually goes to what you and Margaret were just talking about. So there's a question someone has about Martin Scorsese, who's currently filming Killers of the Flower Moon on the Osage Reservation in Oklahoma.
Yeah. So
the question is, if you believe Martin Scorsese actually wants to engage the community there, and the person asking the question says yes, if I am right about Scorsese's commitment, how do we leverage this opportunity for more opportunities for Native filmmakers and actors?
Would that be? Would you like me to speak to that?
If you have an answer.
Yeah. Actually, the interesting thing is that Martin Scorsese, from the casting choices that he's making, and for me, honestly, the idea is can we form a partnership, an allyship with Scorsese, maybe some of his partners and everything else, to where we can think about what comes after it, what's next, rather than what do we do with this one thing and we get in this panic mode, and ask him can we start talking about, can you support more Native writers, directors, producers, people behind the scenes, and help them? And to that, I would say, let's not just do it rhetorically. There are unions that guide this stuff. So if you have camera operators, can you hire some Native American camera people that actually can start to earn points to get into that union? Costume designers, all of these different things. These are practical ways of having that actually do it, rather than just kind of be like, yeah, we support you. And the other thing that I think that Martin Scorsese did, and I haven't talked about how SAG-AFTRA, the actor union guild, has said that it's illegal to ask or to even acknowledge or request proof of tribal enrollment, which is not. The U.S. Supreme Court has said this. But in talking to different casting directors about wanting to cast Native Americans for different films, so one casting director I spoke to, who asked me not to name her, she said, when she goes to a place, Georgia, Louisiana, she likes to cast with locals. You can't do that if you go to a reservation, because according to SAG-AFTRA, that's a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What Scorsese is doing, which is awesome, he's saying, well, then I want people who speak the language, which means now he's found a way, which I think is brilliant, of like sidestepping people who are self-identified, and nothing against Johnny Depp or Elizabeth Warren. I get them, bless them. But it's a way of sidestepping people who are self-identified and people that have a more lived experience connection to the tribe. So he's saying, if you can actually speak these languages, then we'll do it, which I was like, oh, that's really, really smart.
Yeah, and maybe it means too, that maybe in the future too, we can have some evolution to acknowledging the tribal affiliation part of Title VII, as well as having more production on and major productions. Tatiana, I want to ask you about invisible disabilities, because it seems like it gets into this really interesting area where it's this large percentage of people in the United States who have disabilities, but how many of them actually are invisible, and what does that mean for authentic representation when Michelle's telling her story of having epilepsy, but of course she's trying to hide it. Like, what does all of that mean to you when you hear that about that in the industry?
Well, first of all, I do a lot of conversations about language, and it's actually the best way to frame it is to call it non-visible disability. So it's like, because you still have it, but it's non-visible instead of invisible.
Really visible, maybe.
Yeah. But I mean, it hurts my heart when I hear, because I hear these stories all the time of people saying that, I was told to hide, to hide it. But what that does is it makes it a lot harder for someone like myself who has a more visible disability, because it continues to deny disability. So I feel people with non-visible disabilities, you have a choice to whether you want to identify or not. But in settings where you need accommodations, because you are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think a lot of people don't realize that when the Civil Rights Act was written, disabled people weren't included in that. We didn't get rights until the Americans with Disabilities Act. So under that, you have accommodation requests. Any job, employment, education, you have legal rights. So ask for those accommodations that you need. I need extra time. I need this. But when people like that that have the non-visible disabilities can go in the room and say, these are the things I need. I have a disability and I'm protected under the Disability Act. It really opens up the conversation for someone like myself who has a more visible disability, whereas I don't have the choice to hide it. Otherwise, we're going to have an industry that continues to be uncomfortable with people who have more visible disabilities. So we have to continue to do what we can to disrupt the industry to make it for the people that have the more visible, undesirable disabilities.
Right. Thank you so much, Tatiana. Michelle, it looked like you wanted to chime in a little bit about that as well.
Oh yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I agree with her. And you know, you're always your own best advocate. And you know, as someone who I've just always had to be really clear from the get-go with every job, and you know, it becomes a protection as well, and just making sure that you have a boundary. And yes, it is backed up by the law.
Great. Thank you so much. This one I open up to all of you, so whoever wants to jump in around this one. So Nikko, Rebecca, or Margaret as well. How do we older artists support up and coming younger artists? And part of that is just a question of people who actually have some influence. How do they leverage that for others? And it was the context of older artists specifically.
Hire us. Give us the coin. Give us the money. Put us in positions of power and be willing to step aside when we can speak from a learned and lived experience, right? Get comfortable with the uncomfortable. That if you are really welcoming someone into that process, that also means there has to be equal footing, right? I also talk with friends a lot that this idea of the true apprenticeship, the true internship, the true, you know, relationship with someone that is different from you and giving them that position of privilege is kind of gone. That doesn't exist for my generation coming up. No one is putting me under their wing, right? As we say, because we're disruptors to systems, but someone who is within the system, I think it would be an advantage to diversify your mindset, to talk about these new systems that Margaret is developing and saying, oh, well, I know that's going to make me extinct in my operating ways. I want to be closer to that person that is envisioning the new trajectory of where this industry is going. So I think embracing this idea of change and giving these people privilege in power and finances to learn, right, of the system that is more intimately, so that we can create change out of it and being in a position of power to create that change.
Great. Thank you so much. It ties in very nicely to this next question, is about what are some ways to organize or reorganize the distribution structure for film and TV? And there's a follow-on up for theater. But let's start with, is there a way that we need to be restructuring everything, the distribution? Yes, Margaret. Yes, looks like you have something.
You know, well, I've been talking a lot. I've been working with a couple people that are on the international film scene, and one of them is from China, and he said, I just don't understand why these distributors take so much money. And we were talking about, he said one of his best friends is owner of the equivalency to like Amazon in China. And he said, well, he told me that he would put my film on the side of every single one of his packages, and they deliver, you know, 1 billion packages a day in China. And I just thought, I think there's a way, and I mean, it's going to be very upsetting to a lot of distributors, but they're with brands looking for ways, especially now that we're at home, a lot of the time with brands looking for ways to get to us, like, I think that there may be some up and coming ways to sidestep traditional distribution and, you know, figure out a way to find your audience with money that isn't from within the system. Because I swear, every time I turn on Netflix and Amazon, it's like they show me the same 10 things, even if they're in different categories. And I'm like, this cannot be in new releases and classics and something we think you'd like, and, you know, thriller and, you know, comedy. Like so anyway, I think that it's finding a way. You know, I think there's going to be this new Uber Lyft to distribution, as there was for taxis, because I just feel like Hollywood is like the worst hot, stinky taxi. So
Thank you. Rebecca, I want to actually follow up because Naomi McDougall-Jones actually is gone the distribution route. And then she decided with her film, I think, Bite Me, that she was just going to hire the theaters herself and she was going to show her film and she's going to take a tour, and she actually made more money. Are there routes like that, Rebecca, that you think would actually shift where audiences go? That's the question too. Are we going to be able to get those big audiences?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we could talk about it all day. I think there's going to be a shift, and there has been a shift. I think we've seen with the pandemic, theaters closing down. In Los Angeles, I know it was just announced that, help me out here, the chain of theaters.
AMC.
Yes. Has shut down. I've talked to people who work at Netflix and Amazon, like what's going to be the new model, and I think a lot of them are like figuring out, do we purchase these? And which is a little scary to me that Amazon's gonna it's totally terrifying to me. But what I think is gonna I think there's gonna be this emergence, and I really hope, I think, looking at like blockchain technology and financing and how things get financed, I think there's going to be emergence like in the 70s of like the small indie film, because I don't think that studios know how to make anything that's under, $400 million. And I think I hope, I'm going to come in here optimistic, that this change, the system is broken. It's going to break and we're going to see it. And I'm hoping that the emergence of like filmmakers who know how to work in the $1 million, $5 million space, who are willing to tell stories that are extraordinary. When you look at Moonlight, I think that's just the start of filmmakers who are going to be making films that are meaningful and impactful and that will make waves in the industry. I can't speak to I'm going to call Margaret and like chat, because I feel like you understand that piece more than I could ever.
I feel so dirty even knowing about it.
I love stinky cab. I'm going to take that whole phrase. But what I know is filmmakers, and what I know is that filmmakers specifically who are coming from a BIPOC background, from a marginalized background, are not taking the status quo anymore. And they are at this point demanding that their films get financed. I think you're going to see a lot more emergence of like people who are willing to take bets and willing to finance films. And I'm hoping, to the question before of what can people do, contact, smaller nonprofits who are disruptors. When you look at different people who are working with artists, start mentoring, start connecting with them. Those filmmakers have projects that are ready to go, that are amazing, that really just need someone to say, I believe in you. Here's the finance to back that up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So speaking of audiences, though, so part of it is obviously there are a lot of us who are here and attending, and we actually care about these things, and we're invested, and we're a little bit more discerning with what we consume. But for a lot of audiences, they're not that invested in it, or maybe, for whatever reason. How do we make audiences that are actually putting the money into the pockets of these projects that we'd rather took a different route? How do we get them to care about equity and diversity? How do we actually convince them? And that's open to anyone.
I'll say one thing really, really quick. A lot of times, yes, I hate that we have to talk about money, but money makes it all go around. And according to Nielsen, they did a study a few years ago. The disability market is worth over $1 trillion. It is the third largest market in the world, and we've barely scratched the surface of it. So not only is it the right thing to do because we are the most marginalized demographic that intersects into every other demographic, we also economically smart because it's worth over $1 trillion.
Thank you. And how do we get audiences on board with this?
I mean, when you say audiences now, it's a tricky question, I think. I mean, serving on the League of Historic American Theaters board, a few years ago, everyone just decided out of the blue, like, oh, we need a diverse board. And it's like, I said, well, then we need to tell the truth. We need to talk about how theaters used to be a place of discrimination, and we can't just change that balcony to pretend like it was never there. And I think part of the history of theater going is rife with really terrible things that white people have done. And so I sort of think that's why Broadway has sort of skewed, in that direction. I think part of it is that they say if you go to a theater before you're 12, you'll go to the theater later. So it goes back to what Nikko said about education. It's like, if we can just educate the younger generation, I don't know if the older generation can be saved, truthfully, or changed, but I do think, them being introduced to more diverse content is a start. But I think it's about, starting with the kids, because and also not hiding the stories. Like if you have a venue or a theater, to dedicate a portion of the theater to the history and to what actually happened,
Yeah.
Well, I'm older. Don't write us all off.
You are not.
Yes, I am. All right. I think this is our last question. So please do jump in. In terms of manufacturing images that we see so much of in the media, how might we understand and measure success and recognition in a landscape that is still engaged in hero worship? Are we still in the day and age of happy endings?
I mean, to me, that's a question of the power of ideas and how we're wondering if the packaged ideas of Hollywood really compete with reality. And it just makes me think of how local news funding has been gutted over the last 20 years. And so people have really lost a connection to their communities and to the stories and the people around them. And maybe it makes them more susceptible to these larger artifices that come out through the system, the studio system. So I think maybe we, break that with the little documentaries that people are making through, cell phones and iPhones and through YouTube and whatnot. And so I think there is that potential there.
Thank you. I
also think that
Yeah.
this kind of thinking about the idea of heroes and happy endings and are we doing that? Well, I think that we have to think about redefining what we mean. Who is the hero? Who is the hero to? Who is it speaking to? What is a happy ending? Because if we've assigned the white male to be the hero and the dark-skinned person to be the evildoer, then if we flip the entire way of thinking about it, it's like all of a sudden the dark-skinned person is going to prevail. And could that be a happy ending? So it's a different way of thinking about the whole thing. The other thing I think it also goes to, in terms of kind of returning to the past question, this idea of building an audience for this stuff. I think it goes to what Nikko was talking about, which is the idea of education to build community. And by that, I mean, what if we got these marginalized communities to be more part of the producing of these productions, so that we're not just talking at them, right? Oh, we made something for you, you poor little people. Here you go. Here's the offering. It's like, no. You were part of the creation. You were part of lugging the camera equipment. You were part of the cast. You were part of the writers, the directors. You were part of the entire team. And when they feel ownership of it, when they feel that this is part of who they are, an expression of who they are, then they're like telling their friends, their families, their aunties, their uncles, yo, man, you got to come check out this thing that we made. I think that's a way of starting to actually use production to build community, to educate people, but then also to build your audience as well. That's very idealistic.
No, I love it. I love it. And thank you all so very much. I wish I could just chat with you for another 2 hours of your day to hear all of your brilliant insights. I do want to share, just as a last thought, it's thank you from one of our audience members who says, thank you all for such valuable insights. None of you were ever treated with kid gloves and have found a space for yourselves in spite of the difficulties. And a shout out to Annie and Juan as well. So thank you all so much for that. I want to take some time next to thank Clifford Alexander, our 2021 Getting Played Equity Award recipient, who couldn't be with us today, but he did let us hold on to his award until after the symposium to show it off. And I'm going to see if I can make it float in space. Fancy. Okay. All right. Mr. Alexander was born in 1933 in New York City. He attended Harvard University and was elected student council president, graduating in 1955. After he graduated from Yale Law School in 1958, he married Adele Logan and served in the Army Reserves while an assistant New York City district attorney. Mr. Alexander was called to Washington to work under President Kennedy for the National Security Council. And when Lyndon Johnson became president, Mr. Alexander first served as assistant White House counsel. In 1967, he became chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. His controversial advocacy for equal opportunities for minorities and women led to his firing by Richard Nixon. When in 1969, the EEOC announced clear evidence of entertainment industry discrimination in violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, following lobbying by the film industry, Mr. Alexander, as hearing chair, was called before a Senate Justice Subcommittee and subjected to a tongue lashing, as one journalist described, by the powerful Senate Republican Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, who blasted, "Stop some of this harassment of the business community, like your carnival hearing out there in Los Angeles, or I'm going to the highest authority in this government to get somebody fired." President Nixon announced a week later that Clifford Alexander was to be replaced. Mr. Alexander subsequently practiced law in DC and taught law at Georgetown and Howard law schools. Appointed by President Jimmy Carter, Mr. Alexander served as the nation's first minority service secretary as Secretary of the Army from 1977 to 1981. In 1981, he formed Alexander and Associates, a consulting firm specializing in generating opportunities for minorities and women, which continued until 2012. During the early 2000s, Clifford Alexander also served as chief executive and president of the Moody's Corporation and chairman of the board of Dance Theater of Harlem. We are honored to recognize Clifford Alexander's contributions to equity within the entertainment industry, and we thank you, Mr. Alexander, for your service to this nation and its promise. As we leave this year's Getting Played Symposium, Clifford Alexander is a great reminder of the need for collaborations between lawyers and workers, consumers, and communities. Our success requires all of us. We must also keep our eye on how influential the entertainment industry is, its negative sway, and its great potential. In that vein, we leave you with Old Speller, the live action version of Kennedy Center Citizen Artist Fellow Marvin K. White's brilliant poem of the same name, which introduces us to a new word, melancholy. It certainly captures my frequent mood. Thank you to our panelists, Tatiana Lee, Michelle Kantor, Nikko Kimzin, Margaret Lake, and Rebecca Murga, to Myrt, to Natalie, Annie, Juan, to all of you. See you next year. Thank you for coming.